The morning mist clung to the pine trees like ghostly fingers when Jake first noticed the extra tent at Campsite 7. Its green fabric moving rhythmically as if someone was breathing inside. Even though no one had checked in for that spot at Whisper Pines Campground. Have you ever felt that primal fear when you realize you're not alone when you should be? That tent wasn't supposed to be there. The ranger confirmed it twice over the radio. Yet there it stood, zipped tight from the inside, with the unmistakable sound of slow, steady breathing coming from within. And what made Jake's blood run cold was seeing the sleeping bag inside rise and fall, with no visible body occupying it. The weekend had started like any other camping trip for Jake and his 3 college friends, driving up the winding mountain roads to Whisper Pines, a remote campground known for its pristine lakes and hiking trails. Not for the local legends they dismissed as small-town nonsense about campers who never left and tents that appeared overnight without explanation. They'd laughed off the old gas station attendant's warning about staying away from Campsite 7, how it had been closed for years after the incident nobody would talk about. But now, as they stood frozen 20 feet from that impossible tent, watching condensation form on the inside of the fabric from someone's breath, someone who cast no shadow and left no footprints in the dirt, those warnings didn't seem so ridiculous anymore. The ranger wouldn't come until morning. Cell phones had no signal this deep in the pines. And darkness was falling fast, while that rhythmic breathing grew louder, more agitated, as if whatever slept in that tent was beginning to wake up, beginning to sense their presence. And the zipper slowly started moving from the inside. If this story sends chills down your spine, hit that subscribe button for more terrifying tales from the dark corners of America's backroads. Jake's hand trembled as he reached for his flashlight, the beam cutting through the gathering darkness to illuminate that impossible tent, while his friends Mark, Sarah, and Derek huddled behind him, their breathing shallow and quick in the mountain air that had suddenly grown thick with an unnatural stillness. The zipper continued its agonizing journey upward, metal teeth separating one by one with deliberate slowness, and through the thin fabric, they could see the shadow of something shifting inside. Something that moved wrong, too fluid like smoke given form. And Sarah grabbed Jake's arm so tight her nails drew blood when the zipper finally stopped halfway and a pale hand emerged. Fingers too long, knuckles bending in places they shouldn't. "We need to leave now," Derek whispered. But their feet seemed rooted to the pine needle carpet as that hand gripped the tent flap and slowly, impossibly slowly, began pulling it aside, revealing nothing but impenetrable darkness within. A void that seemed to swallow their flashlight beams whole. And from that darkness came a voice that wasn't quite human, speaking words in a language none of them recognized, but somehow understood in their bones. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds, their breath forming clouds as frost spread across the tent fabric like cancer. And Mark stumbled backward when a figure began emerging from that darkness, translucent at first, gradually solidifying into the shape of a man wearing outdated camping gear from decades past, his eyes milky white and fixed on them with an intensity that made their skin crawl. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure said, its voice like wind through dead leaves. And as it stepped fully out of the tent, they saw its feet never touch the ground, hovering inches above the dirt, while behind it, more shadows began stirring inside the tent, more hands pressing against the fabric from within, dozens of them, and the breathing sound multiplied into a chorus of the restless dead. The ranger's voice crackled through Jake's walkie-talkie, barely audible through the static, warning them about something called the Gathering. how every 7 years the lost campers returned to claim new members for their eternal campfire. And tonight marked exactly 7 years since the last disappearances at Whisper Pines. Information the ranger had deliberately withheld when they'd checked in that morning. The ghostly camper raised one elongated arm toward them, and the forest itself seemed to respond, branches creaking and groaning as if the trees were leaning in to watch. Pine needles swirling in impossible patterns, while more tents began materializing throughout the campground, each one glowing with that same sickly phosphorescent light, each one breathing with its own horrible rhythm. And Jake realized with dawning horror that they weren't just witnessing something supernatural. They were being invited to join it, to zip themselves into those waiting tents and become part of the eternal gathering that haunted these woods. Sarah's scream pierced the night as one of the phosphorescent tents suddenly appeared directly behind Derek, its zipper already halfway open. And before anyone could react, pale arms shot out from within, wrapping around his waist and yanking him backward with supernatural strength, while his desperate fingers clawed at the ground, leaving deep furrows in the dirt as he was dragged inch by horrifying inch toward that glowing entrance. Jake lunged forward, grabbing Derek's hands just as his legs disappeared into the tent. And for a moment, they were locked in a grotesque tug of war with whatever dwelled inside. Derek's face contorted in terror as he gasped that it was cold. So cold it burned. And through the tent's translucent walls, they could see dozens of shadow figures pressing against him, their hands pulling him deeper into their realm. Mark fumbled with his camping knife, slashing at the ethereal arms, but the blade passed through them like mist. And the ghostly camper who had first emerged began laughing, a sound like breaking glass that made their ears bleed, explaining in that horrible voice that once you touched the threshold of their world, you belonged to them. And Derek's eyes were already beginning to turn that same milky white. The walkie-talkie screeched with the ranger's frantic voice, telling them the only way to break the gathering was to destroy the original tent at Campsite 7, to burn it before midnight when the veil would become permanent. But as Jake looked at his watch, the digital display flickered and showed impossible times, jumping backward and forward as if time itself was unraveling in this cursed place. With a final, desperate heave, they managed to pull Derek free, his body ice cold and convulsing, whispering about the things he'd seen in those few seconds inside the tent, about the hundreds of campers trapped between worlds, forced to relive their final moments over and over, and how the tents were doorways that grew stronger with each soul they claimed. Jake made the decision that would haunt him forever, leaving Mark to carry the semi-conscious Derek while he and Sarah sprinted toward Campsite 7, dodging the materialized tents that kept appearing in their path, each one reaching out with those terrible arms. And when they finally reached the original green tent, Jake doused it with the emergency gasoline from his pack, his hands shaking so violently he could barely strike the match. The moment the flames touched the fabric, an inhuman shriek erupted from every tent simultaneously, a sound that shattered the windows of Jake's truck 100 yards away. And the ghostly camper's face twisted with rage as he began dissolving, warning them that fire only delayed the inevitable, that the gathering would return, stronger and hungrier, and they would remember the faces of those who had defied them. As the tent burned with unnatural blue flames that climbed toward the stars, all the other tents began flickering and fading like dying light bulbs, the shadow figures within writhing and clawing at the fabric as they were pulled back to wherever such nightmares dwelled. But not before Jake saw something that would rob him of sleep for years to come. Among those desperate shadows were faces he recognized from missing person posters at the ranger station. and one of them looked exactly like Derek, even though Derek was right there with them, suggesting that perhaps some part of him had been left behind, claimed by the darkness despite their rescue. They ran through the darkness as the burning tent cast dancing shadows between the pines. Derek stumbling between them, with frost still clinging to his skin, his breath coming in ragged gasps that sounded wrong, too deep, as if something else was breathing through him. And when they finally reached the parking area, Jake's truck wouldn't start, the engine turning over with a grinding sound while the radio spontaneously burst to life, cycling through stations that shouldn't exist, each one broadcasting the voices of missing campers calling for help from inside their tents. Sarah noticed it first, the way Derek's shadow moved independently from his body under the moonlight, stretching toward the forest as if trying to return to campsite 7. And when she shone her flashlight directly on him, they all saw the horrible truth. His shadow had multiple arms, dozens of them, all reaching back toward where they'd come from. And Derek's eyes, though conscious and terrified, reflected not one but hundreds of tiny campfires that hadn't been there before. The ranger's truck roared into the parking lot, Officer Chen jumping out with a shotgun loaded with rock salt blessed by the local Native American elder. A last resort he'd never had to use before. Shouting that they needed to get Derek past the wooden Whisper Pines entrance sign before the moon reached its apex. That crossing that threshold was the only way to break the partial claim the gathering had on him. But Derek suddenly dropped to his knees, his mouth opening impossibly wide as he began to speak in voices that weren't his own, reciting the names and death dates of every camper who'd vanished at Whisper Pines since 1978. Mark grabbed Derek's left arm while Jake took the right, dragging their friend toward the entrance as his body grew heavier with each step, as if invisible hands were pulling him down into the earth. And Sarah ran ahead, tearing down the yellow caution tape that had appeared across the entrance road, tape that hadn't been there when they'd arrived, covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, symbols that seemed to crawl and writhe like living things. With only minutes until midnight, Derek's skin began to turn translucent, revealing dark shapes moving beneath like schools of phantom fish. And he whispered through tears that he could feel them all, every soul trapped in the gathering, that they were so lonely, so cold, and they just wanted others to understand their pain, to share in their eternal camping trip where the sun never rose and the tents never came down, where marshmallows roasted over fires that gave no heat and songs around the campfire were sung by mouths that no longer had faces. The moment they crossed under the Whisper Pine sign, Derek collapsed, his body convulsing as shadows poured from his mouth like black smoke, forming briefly into the shapes of reaching hands before dissipating in the wind. And Officer Chen quickly covered him with a blanket woven with protective symbols, explaining that Derek would live but would never be the same, that a piece of him would always remain at Campsite 7, calling others to join the gathering. And sure enough, as they drove away in the ranger's truck, Jake looked back to see Derek's shadow still standing at the entrance, waving goodbye with too many arms, a permanent guardian warning future campers, or perhaps inviting them in, they would never know which. 6 months later, Jake still couldn't sleep without checking every corner of his apartment for tents that shouldn't be there. And Mark had dropped out of college after developing an obsessive compulsion to count shadows, convinced that having more than one meant the gathering was coming for him, while Sarah spent her nights researching every disappearance at Whisper Pines, creating a map that showed a horrifying pattern. The vanishings formed a perfect spiral with Campsite 7 at its center, growing wider each year like ripples in dark water. Officer Chen called Jake one October evening with news that made his blood freeze. Derek had been found back at Whisper Pines, sitting cross-legged in front of the charred remains of Campsite 7, speaking to empty tents that only he could see. Having driven there in his sleep 3 nights in a row. And when they tried to remove him, he'd screamed that the gathering was incomplete, that it needed one more soul to finish what had been started in 1978 when the first family had vanished, leaving behind only their tent and the lingering smell of marshmallows that never quite went away. The investigation files Chen secretly shared revealed that Whisper Pines had been built on the site of an old revival camp, where a traveling preacher had convinced 37 followers to shed their earthly vessels and transcend into something eternal. But the ritual had gone wrong, trapping them between worlds, forever camping in a dimension that overlapped with ours, visible only as empty tents and shadows that moved without bodies, waiting for enough souls to join them to complete their congregation and finally move on to whatever dark paradise they'd been promised. Jake drove back to Whisper Pines against every instinct screaming at him to stay away, finding Derek exactly where Chen had described. But now Derek's eyes were completely black, reflecting stars that didn't match the sky above. And he spoke in a voice layered with harmonies of the dead, explaining that Jake had been chosen from the beginning, that the tent at Campsite 7 had been waiting specifically for him, that every camper who'd ever vanished had seen something in those woods that marked them. And Jake's mark had been burning behind his eyes since that first night, growing stronger with each nightmare where he found himself zipping up a tent from the inside, unable to remember how he'd gotten there. The truth was worse than any of them had imagined. The gathering wasn't taking random victims, but calling to those who carried a specific frequency in their souls, a resonance that matched the failed ritual's energy. And Jake realized with mounting horror that he'd been hearing the whispers all along, dismissed as wind through pine needles, but actually voices calling him home, telling him that his tent was ready, his spot at the eternal campfire was waiting, and all he had to do was zip himself inside and let the transformation begin, to become one with the shadows that danced between the trees, forever part of Whisper Pines, where checkout time never came and the camping trip never ended, where friends sat around fires that cast no warmth and told stories that had no endings, only beginnings that spiraled back on themselves like the pattern of disappearances, like the maze of trails that all led back to Campsite 7, where something ancient and patient waited with infinite hospitality for guests who would never, could never, refuse to ever leave. The burning behind Jake's eyes intensified as he stood there facing Derek in the darkness of Whisper Pines. And when he blinked, he could see them all. Hundreds of transparent tents scattered through the forest, like jellyfish floating in dark water, each one pulsing with the slow breath of souls trapped between sleeping and waking, between life and whatever came after. And Derek's black eyes reflected not just foreign stars, but entire constellations of the lost, each point of light a camper who'd answered the call and zipped themselves into eternity. Sarah arrived just after midnight, having tracked Jake's phone to its last known location. But when she found him standing motionless beside Derek, both of them staring at something she couldn't see, she realized the spiral pattern she'd mapped wasn't just showing disappearances. It was a countdown, a cosmic timer that had been ticking since 1978. And according to her calculations, it would complete its final revolution at 3:17 a.m., the exact moment the original ritual had failed, the moment when 37 souls had tried to transcend, but instead became anchors for something that should never have existed. Mark showed up an hour later, drawn by the same invisible pull that had brought them all back. his shadow count now at 7, even though he stood alone. And when he spoke, his voice carried echoes of conversations, from camping trips that had never happened, memories of sitting around fires with friends whose faces he couldn't quite remember, but whose laughter still rang in his ears, hollow and eternal like wind chimes made from bones. The tent at campsite 7 began to glow with a sickly green phosphorescence, and Jake felt his feet moving toward it without his permission, each step heavier than the last, as if walking through increasingly dense water. While Derek walked beside him reciting names and dates, every person who'd vanished at Whisper Pines, their ages when they disappeared, what they'd been wearing, what their last words had been before they'd crawled into tents that had been waiting for them since before they were born. Predetermined destinations in a journey that had started with that failed ritual and wouldn't end until the number was complete. At 3:16 a.m., 1 minute before the spiral's completion, Jake found himself kneeling in front of the glowing tent, his hand reaching for the zipper while Sarah screamed his name from what seemed like miles away. But her voice was drowned out by the harmonious breathing of hundreds of souls in their eternal tents, a rhythm that matched his heartbeat, that pulled at something deep in his chest, something that wanted nothing more than to crawl inside and join them, to finally understand what it meant to be truly at peace in a place where time meant nothing. And the campfire never died, where stories were told in languages that predated words, and everyone was always arriving but never leaving, always unpacking but never quite settling in, always promising to head home in the morning but never seeing the sun rise, because in that space between worlds, between the tent fabric and the forest floor, between breathing in and breathing out, there was no morning, only an endless twilight where shadows danced without bodies and voices sang without mouths, where the only rule was that once you zipped yourself in, you became part of the gathering, part of the eternal campground, where checkout was a myth and the real horror wasn't being trapped, but realizing you'd never wanted to leave in the first place. Jake's hand touched the zipper at exactly 3:17 a.m., and in that instant, he understood everything. The failed ritual hadn't been a failure at all, but a beginning. A cosmic invitation that required precisely 333 souls to complete the circle. And he was number 332. With Derek being 333, the final pieces in a puzzle that stretched across dimensions where camping was eternal and checkout was a forgotten concept from a reality that no longer mattered. As the zipper opened from both sides simultaneously, Jake saw himself reflected infinitely in the darkness within. Every version of himself that could have been, would have been, and now was, all crawling into tents across endless forests, all breathing in perfect synchronization with the ancient rhythm that had called them home. And Sarah's screams became part of the forest symphony, another voice in the eternal chorus of those who'd witnessed but couldn't follow, condemned to remember what others would dismiss as legend. The tent swallowed Jake whole, not with violence, but with the gentleness of a mother tucking in a child. And as the fabric sealed behind him, Whisper Pines exhaled collectively. Every tree, every stone, every blade of grass releasing a breath they'd been holding for 45 years. And in the morning, the Rangers would find nothing. No extra tent, no missing campers, no evidence except Sarah's incoherent testimony about friends who'd never existed according to the records, about a camping trip that never happened, about a campsite 7 that had been permanently closed since 1978. And she would spend her remaining years mapping spirals and counting shadows, always arriving at the same impossible number: 0.